Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for being here with us today on a Thursday afternoon before a long weekend. If you have a long weekend coming up, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. As you get settled in, go ahead and post in the chat. Let us know where you are coming from today, how you're doing. What are your plans for the long weekend? If you have a long weekend. Hi, Kathy. Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome, everybody. Kathy again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Thursday afternoon to learn more about how to create an inclusive learning environment at your center. Such an important topic. We have an amazing webinar lined up for you today. Welcome, everybody. Heidi, Michelle, Dawn, Lisa, thank you all so much for being here with us today on this Thursday afternoon. Again, a Thursday before a long weekend. I don't know about the rest of you, but here at HiMama, we are closing our office doors tomorrow for Canada Day here in Canada. I know it's also July 4th coming up. Let us know, do you have a long weekend coming up? What are your plans for the long weekend? Do you have any big barbecues? Do you go anywhere? Going camping in Colorado. That sounds like an amazing plan for the long weekend. Really disconnect that way. Welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Maddie, for those of you who have never met me before, and I will be your host of today's webinar. We are going to wait just one more minute. I want to make sure everyone has time to settle in. Grab a coffee, grab a tea, grab your water. Close your office doors if you can. Find a quiet space if that is doable at all, if you're at a childcare center right now. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy weeks to be here and to learn more about creating an inclusive learning environment at your center. I am so excited to get started. I've had a sneak peek at the slides and you're in for a wonderful presentation today. So thank you all for being here. Just a couple more seconds there. And again, if you are just joining us, go ahead and let us know in the chat where you're coming from today. Let us know if you have a long weekend. I'm very excited. We have a 4-day long weekend here at HiMama. Welcome, Belinda. Welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay. It is just a minute past 2 o'clock here Eastern time. So we're going to go ahead and give the music a quick pause so we can get started. Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday, my favorite day of the week. My name is Maddie, and I will be your host of today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us to learn more about creating an inclusive learning environment at your center. Such an important topic. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, quick reminder, if you didn't know, we are now doing a very exciting giveaway in every single webinar. So please keep coming every Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern time to increase your chances of winning that webinar's giveaway. Giveaway for today. Everybody who has registered for today's live webinar automatically is entered for a chance to win a $50 gift card. Keep an eye out for our show notes email. That will be coming to you by early next week. And in that email, we will be announcing the winner. If you are the winner, we will also contact you directly. So do not worry about getting in contact with us. I promise we will reach out to you, but keep an eye out for that email so you can see who the lucky winner is. As always, a quick disclaimer before we get started. The content that we are sharing with you today is not personalized legal or financial advice. Okay, so the goal today is for everyone to leave today's webinar with some amazing tips, tricks, and techniques for you to bring into your centers, into your classrooms, into your homes, wherever it may be. But if you are looking at making any big changes at your center, we do just want to make sure that you are consulting the right people to make those changes, such as a legal or a financial advisor. We're now going to give a listen to our land acknowledgement.
HiMama acknowledges that our main headquarters is situated in Toronto, Ontario, on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto itself is a word that originates from the Mohawk word takaranto, meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing. As participants and guests in today's webinar, we are coming together from many different places around the world. We encourage you to learn about and acknowledge the land from which you participate.
And we are now going to give a listen to our diversity and inclusion statement.
HiMama is committed to fostering an inclusive and welcoming environment for our employees, customers, and community. HiMama welcomes and celebrates individuals of all backgrounds, orientations, and identities. Our Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee aims to ensure we provide a safe environment for everyone to thrive while bringing their authentic selves to work. Our mission is to promote an inclusive workspace for all employees through education, discussion, and celebration of our differences. Embracing these differences while coming together with a common purpose is what makes our team extra special.
And as always, a few housekeeping pieces before we get started. We are recording today's session as always. We will be sending out the recording by early next week. So if for any reason at all you do have to hop off, do not worry. You will be getting the recording by early next week. Also note that we are recording with the closed captions enabled. So those will be in the recording for you, though if you do require the closed captions for today's live webinar, please be sure to hit that CC tab on your side of the Zoom now so you can have those on. In terms of the certificate, so everybody who is here today in our live webinar will absolutely be receiving a certificate of participation for being here with us today. We will get those out to you by early next week. So as always, don't worry if you don't see it today, maybe not even tomorrow. We will absolutely work on getting those out to you by early next week. So just keep an eye out in your inbox then. And lastly, if you're having any issues at all with your Zoom, we certainly hope you're not, but if you do, we just want to make sure that you are contacting the right people who can help you, which is the support team over at Zoom. You can contact them at support.zoom.us. Lena has just posted a link in the chat if you do need to contact them for any reason. Okay, and a little bit about HiMama. Welcome. If you have never heard of us before, I'm so happy you are here. Let us know in the chat if this is your very first webinar with us. If it is, welcome. And I certainly hope that we will start to see you every Thursday from now on. If you didn't know, on top of our wonderful professional development community with our weekly webinars, our weekly podcasts, HiMama is also the #1 rated childcare management app. So HiMama is designed to support directors, educators, and families in making their lives as easy as possible when it comes to parent communication, sharing photos with families, documenting learning and development in the classroom, all of your billing needs. It's all in HiMama for you. So if you are interested in learning more about HiMama and seeing if HiMama would be a good fit at your center, please do contact us and we can show you around. Lena will post a link in the chat for how you can learn a little bit more about HiMama. I'm also looking at the chat here and I see some new people to our webinar today. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Also, please know that if you do join the HiMama family, I absolutely promise you, you will receive world-class support. Sometimes switching from pen and paper to digital communication can be a really big jump, and we are absolutely here to help you. I used to work on our customer success team, and I can say from firsthand experience, it is an absolutely beautiful group of humans here to hold your hand and be there with you as you make this transition. Also know that on top of our weekly webinars, we also have weekly podcasts available. We have hundreds of articles by industry experts that we put out to support you. And we are also a B certified company. So what that means is that as we work with our amazing community of educators, we are also working to actively make a positive impact in the early childhood education space. Okay, and your hosts. If you've never met me before, again, my name's Maddie. I am our host of our HiMama Helps webinar series. I'm also a customer advocacy specialist here at HiMama, and I'm also one of the early childhood educators here on the HiMama team. As always, I have my lovely co-host, Lena. Lena, welcome. Lena, what's going on with you today? What are your extra long weekend plans coming up?
Hi everyone, so excited to be here today. I'm actually going to go to a concert this weekend, so I'm very excited for that.
Amazing. Sounds so fun. All right. And last but not least, our special guest for today, the one and only Kayla Warburton. Kayla, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Good. We are so excited to have you. I'm so excited to learn more about creating an inclusive classroom. Kayla, to make sure we maximize our full time together, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I will pass it over to you. The stage is all yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maddie. I really appreciate that. Now, we're going to talk a little bit today, as Maddie said, about creating an inclusive space and anti-oppressive education practices. So as we think about creating a space for everybody, the number one thing that I want to start with, sorry, as I deal with I swear I work for a tech company, as we get that sorted there. The number one things that I wanted to talk about are these three little takeaways here. And of course, there's going to be hopefully a lot more that you're able to take away from today. But I want to make sure that we're taking away the most important things, starting, of course, with learning to expect rather than accommodate. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into what that means. Also making sure we're aware that everyone has bias and not to feel ashamed of this, that the key to this is acknowledging it and taking action. And on that note, the third and in my opinion, most important thing that I'd love for everyone to take away today is to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Okay, so we're going to dive in. Before we do, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's here today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you and know that simply being here and being a part of this conversation is the first step to creating that inclusive space. So you're already well on your way. Okay, so let's dive in. The first thing that I want to talk about here is expecting everyone. It is so important that the spaces that we create are expecting of everyone so that we don't have to accommodate people individually. And we'll dive into that a little bit further in this section. But first, let's start off with some definitions so we can understand really what we're talking about today. So oppression. What is oppression, right? We're going to talk about oppression and privilege a lot, but we need to understand what those terms mean. Now, Kevin Kumashiro writes an article about anti-oppressive education practices, and he notes that whether it be from a feminist, critical, multicultural, queer, or any other perspective, that there is agreement that oppression is a situation or dynamic in which certain ways of being are privileged in society while others are marginalized. So that's the definition that we have there for oppression. And of course, then that leads us into privilege. And what is privilege? Well, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available to only one particular group or person. Now, the example that's given in the Oxford Dictionary is great. It's actually education is a right, not a privilege. So great example because I hear this so often. However, frequently education is actually denied to persons indirectly. For instance, students who have English as their second language may not have the ability to gain the same knowledge from a math class that's in English as a student whose first language is English. So because the ESL learner has an additional barrier to overcome before accessing the knowledge, if the educator has not accounted for this, then that student is being denied the right to equal and equitable education. So because they don't have the privilege of being born into the native language that's being used, they may be denied access to that education. So we do see education as a right, yet only privileged people seem to have access to it. Another example of this is we can consider a family that relies on their children to actually help for income. from a very young age. Those children are not going to be as focused on education. For instance, years ago, I was in Cuba, and as we were getting off the bus, there were children collecting money or collecting plastic bottles from anyone so that they could go get money and bring that back to their families. And the tour guide said to us, please don't give the children money, give them pencils, paper, pens, things like that, because so often they're discouraged from education because it's easier for them to go and make money and help their families than to access the free education that they have. So even though their education is free and it's seen as a right and everyone has that right, not everyone is privileged enough to access that right to education. So how do oppression and privilege affect the learning space? Well, as we talked about, they actually hinder some students from being able to engage in that learning. And learning is actually a very vulnerable action. And most people will not allow themselves to be vulnerable if a space is not safe for them. So we'll speak a little bit more about creating a safe space later on in the presentation. But for now, I'd like you guys to really think about the ways that oppression and privilege might affect your classroom. And I'm asking you all to be very vulnerable by asking you to do that. It's not easy to admit that our classroom spaces or our words or even our actions have oppressed others. But the truth of the matter is that most people have done something that contributes to another individual's oppression at some point in their lives. I'm certainly not pointing fingers or trying to condemn anyone. It is something I have definitely done. So how do I proceed when something like this happens? Well, I work hard to continuously self-reflect, to ask questions, to research, to take professional development courses, to go to webinars like the one that you're at right now. And, as Maddie was mentioning, we don't offer just webinars at HiMama. We also offer ample other products, including HiMama Academy, which is a platform that has access to all kinds of professional development courses, including one on anti-oppressive education that I wrote. There's also courses on gender equity. There's courses on, using the environment as a third learner. So there's lots of different platforms that you can use to engage in professional development that will help you create a space where you're questioning that oppression, where you're questioning that privilege and really understanding it. Now, all of those steps are taking steps towards expanding your knowledge in ways that will reduce the amount of harm that can be implemented. So you may indirectly or directly cause harm, right? So sometimes it's indirect, but in theory, the more aware we are of the consequences of our actions, the more thoughtful those actions will be. So if we're thinking about, for instance, what textbook we want to implement in our classroom, if we choose that textbook from the perspective of all of the students in our classroom rather than just our own, we may actually come to different conclusions about what material to present or how to go about presenting it. For instance, if we have a group discussion and maybe we're sitting down with a group of preschoolers and we ask them, who here's been to Disneyland? Well, we need to consider who we're excluding from that conversation. Perhaps we have low-income families who cannot afford this, or perhaps we have a family that just moved here from somewhere else. They just moved to North America and they haven't ever had a chance to go to Disneyland. How can we engage the discussion in a way that's not oppressive or privileging to any one group? Well, think of different questions that you could ask them. Maybe we could ask the children about a favorite place that they have been, or where's somewhere that you'd really like to go, right? The latter question there being a little bit more open-ended, and you think you're starting from a relatively even playing field. Though also oppression and privilege exists in our imagination as well. Perhaps children aren't able to imagine a world where certain things are possible because of the oppression they experience. And an example that I like to use here is, let's take the President Barack Obama. Before Barack Obama was president, could a child who was Black sit there and say, I can envision myself and imagine myself as president? For sure, they could imagine that, absolutely. But without that role model who has been there and shown them that they can do it, they may have been less likely to imagine that as a possibility. So having role models in these spaces and making sure that there's representation is so important, especially at a young age where that child's imagination is still developing. Now, there is not only one way that we can look at people. There is not only one identity that everyone has. People are often made up of many different identities. We don't all fit into these neat little boxes of one single individual identity marker. So we have to look at intersectionalities. Now, intersectionality is a framework that describes how our overlapping social identities relate to the social structures of oppression, power, and privilege. So intersectionality will merge many different identity markers and create a more truthful and complex identity. But why does this matter? Because people don't fit into those neat little boxes, right? They don't have just one identity marker like we talked about. There are so many different circumstances that a child might come from. For instance, you may have a child in your classroom who has a physical disability and also comes from a low socioeconomic background. Or perhaps you have a child who comes from an LGBTQ plus family who's also biracial. Here, I'll put a personal experience in here. I am a mother to an amazing 2.5-year-old boy, and his father is a Black man, so he's a biracial child. I'm also in a relationship with a woman, so he comes from a family with an LGBTQ background, and he's a biracial individual. Do you know how many areas there are for oppression for that child now? More than one, because his identity is not one thing. So this means there are now multiple entry points for oppression into that child's life. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the different intersectionalities. Another example, you might have an immigrant student who doesn't speak English and has also been diagnosed with a learning disability such as ADHD. Now, these individuals have multiple entry points for oppression, right? That has to be considered. And knowing this actually allows educators to use this lens when they're planning. So you need to understand, for instance, that not all books about Black people represent all Black people. And not all books about Asian people represent all Asian people. Not all books about an LGBTQ movement represent all of the members of the LGBTQ plus communities, right? So understanding the intersectionalities in your classroom will help to ensure that the materials in the environment are inclusive, truly inclusive. So let's take that last example that we just talked about. You have a student who is an immigrant and they do not speak English and they're also diagnosed with ADHD. Now, you may have books in your classroom that discuss and represent ADHD, and you feel that you've done well to represent that student in your classroom, and that's amazing. That's wonderful that we have those resources. Yet perhaps the character in the book who has ADHD speaks fluent English and looks nothing like and behaves nothing like the student in your classroom who has ADHD. Have you still represented this student in a meaningful way in their environment? Maybe not. And of course, it's difficult to find a book that accurately represents each individual child specifically in your class. And that's why we need to get creative. So can you think of some ways that you can get creative with representing different students in books? If you have any ideas, definitely feel free to pop them in the chat. Some of the things that I was thinking were, we could create a book together, go on a journey with those students, an extended little activity together, where you create a book, whether it be of the children's artwork, of photos of the children, letting the children take photos around the room and make a book, writing a story together and having the children design the photos for us, that they feel personally represented in a way that's meaningful for them in the classroom. Okay. So those are all some great options. If you have other ideas, like I said, definitely pop them in there. It's always nice to hear different perspectives. I certainly am not the end all be all source for ideas. And, all of the different options are they'll help ensure that the students feel that representation in the classroom space. And you need those alongside thoughtful planning around curriculum and thoughtful materials and environments being brought into the space. Okay, because intersectionalities they create a space that can be represented by those little overlaps that you see in the chart there. And that's where an individual may feel like they're a part of and not part of a group at the same time. I mean, I have a friend in high school, her mom is a white woman from Scotland, her dad is a Black man from Jamaica. And in high school, she noted that she often felt too Black to be white and too white to be Black. And she was unsure about where she fit in when it came to social groups. She felt like she had to behave a certain way to be accepted by one identity or by another, but never felt that she was accepted for her identity, which was both of those identities at once. They weren't independent of each other. She wasn't just Black or just white. She was both of those at the same time and didn't feel that she was represented and didn't feel that that identity was even accepted. So we're going to talk now about how to be sure that your classroom is expecting of all of these unique students with all of those unique identities. So I mentioned at the beginning of this section, expecting over accommodating. When someone comes into our room and we're accommodating them, it can be daunting. It can also feel, if you're being given an accommodation, you might feel like you have to be grateful for it, even if it's not as helpful, or even if it's something that everyone else is getting, you feel like you have to be grateful because there's this accommodation being made for you. Which is why it's so important to expect everyone before they arrive rather than accommodate for them once they've arrived. So we can expect in many different places. The first one here I say is expect in your lesson planning. So make sure that you plan activities that all of the children have equal access to, rather than modifying an aspect of an activity for one individual. Consider this, that modified version that you were going to use, could that not be the main activity that you plan? Would any children lose out from doing the activity this way if you did it that way for everyone, right? For example, let's say you're playing hide and seek and you have a child in your classroom with a sight impairment. Now, rather than assigning that child a partner, couldn't we just play hide and seek with partners where everyone has a partner so that no child feels like they're being isolated or like they need to be accommodated, but rather they've been expected in that planning? Okay, we can also expect in the environment. So always, and maybe this should be another key takeaway, always have representative materials available and accessible. Black History Month is not the only time to have content with Black characters written by Black people, about Black people. This content should be available year round, right? Asian people do not only exist during Asian Heritage Month, so they should be represented at all times in our classroom, right? This is always difficult for some people because they're like, well, that's a lot for me to have to always have represented in the space. And, but you can combine things. You can have it. You don't have to be like, oh, here's one book about this. Here's one book about this. You can have books that have multiple identities in them, that have multiple intersectionalities, that have representation of all different groups in one individual book, in one individual material, right? Having access to multicultural items, multicultural crayons and Play-Doh and things at all times. And always, always, always question yourself with those tough questions. And don't be afraid of the answers. Asking yourself those questions is going to be the way that it's the way of showing yourself that you're ready to experience some growth and learning, right? And similarly, June is not the only month that we should fly a rainbow flag. LGBTQ+ pride should be prevalent in our space every day. So maintaining that welcoming space, how do we do that, right? We'll first start by thinking about who is that space currently welcoming to. If the answer isn't everyone, then something needs to change. So we should not, again, have to modify and accommodate daily. For instance, let's say you have a child who has mobility issues. We should not be clearing a path for them anytime they need to move about. The space should be set up in a way that the child can navigate with as little assistance as possible or necessary, okay? And the last thing that I'll say here before we move on to the next section is please don't make assumptions. Please don't assume things about people. Ask those people those questions, right? Ask someone if they're for their family, say, hey, could you help us out by providing some resources about your culture? Could you can't be afraid to ask. And it might be uncomfortable. I understand that, it might be an uncomfortable situation or conversation to initiate, but realistically, doing any type of allyship work, you need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? You need to be prepared to have those conversations that may seem a little uncomfortable. For instance, maybe it's Mother's Day and you have a couple that's two men in your as a parent of one of your children. Do you just assume that because they're men, they don't want a Mother's Day card and get that child to maybe make a card for a grandmother or something? This is a situation I've seen play out numerous times. Why don't you ask? Why don't you ask the parents, hi, we are going to be celebrating Mother's Day soon, and we're wondering if you celebrate that in your home and how you go about celebrating it. Would you, we're going to be making a gift. We're going to have the children make them. Would you like us to make 2 gifts for you? Do you celebrate that way? Or would you like her to make a gift for a grandmother? Ask that question. And you know what? Most of the time, you're probably going to get very, very receptive responses. If you don't, definitely don't take that to heart. Just know that that person is probably coming from a place where maybe they've experienced some oppression, and that's very vulnerable discussion for them to have. But please don't make assumptions. Don't be afraid to ask. So this next section is about personal bias. Now, something that we definitely all have personal biases, but rather than feel shame and hide these in the dark, let's shed some light on them, okay? So let's first look at the types of bias that we might have. Now, the Oxford Dictionary defines bias as an inclination or prejudice for or against one person or group, especially in a way considered to be unfair. So explicit bias is actually referring to the attitudes and beliefs that we have about a person or a group on a conscious level. So sometimes these biases and their expression actually arise as the direct result of a perceived threat. When people feel that they're threatened, they're actually more likely to draw group boundaries and distinguish themselves from others. So that's why I say have those conversations where you're not assuming, because you don't want people to feel threatened by your actions when you don't intend them to be that way, right? And now these explicit biases are actually a little bit easier to impact because we're conscious of them. We can question them and learn to grow from them through that awareness. The more difficult side of things is implicit bias, which is referring to the unconscious attitudes, reactions, stereotypes, and categories that affect behavior and understanding. Now, in higher education, implicit bias often refers to unconscious racial or socioeconomic bias towards students, which can be just as frequent as explicit bias. However, can be much more harmful because often people don't realize that they have these preconceived notions until someone points it out to them, or never, right? So be aware of bias. If I were to ask you right in this instance, and I will ask you, so everyone take a moment and just picture a criminal, in your mind, boom, criminal, what does that look like in your mind? Your first image that comes to your head. Is it someone who's maybe hardened looking, low income? What is the race of that person, right? Did anyone picture Martha Stewart or any other wealthy, white, cisgender woman? Maybe, but likely not as many people had that image pop into their head right away. Not to say that whatever you pictured was wrong in any way. In fact, it may have been an accurate representation of a known criminal. The problem is that it is only one perspective, your own. So if instead I asked you to picture six different types of criminals, the likelihood that Martha Stewart or someone like her may be in one of those pictures is greatly heightened. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that if we showcase the importance of perspective, or it tells us that we need to showcase the importance of perspectives when it comes to confronting bias and stereotyping, because the more perspectives that we invite into the discussion, the more likely we are to have a full understanding of something. Okay, which brings me to my last point here. Learn, unlearn, and relearn. And remember, this is probably the most important takeaway that I can say from everything we'll talk about today, because you need to remember that as much as education is a journey for your students, it's a journey for yourself as well. So for everything that you know and learn, be prepared to question it, challenge it, and if unnecessary, unlearn it, and then take the time to relearn it in a healthy way. Okay, that's my recommendation there. Unlearn and relearn in as healthy way as possible with as many different perspectives as you can possibly integrate. Okay, amazing. So the next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about positive stereotypes. So I'd like to take a moment. If anyone can think of a positive stereotype, feel free to pop it in the chat there. And I promise it's not necessarily a trick question. If the answer to that is that you don't think there are positive stereotypes, that's also a great answer. But if you genuinely can think of something that may be a positive stereotype, I would love to hear that for sure. And so before we jump into combating biases and other barriers to anti-oppressive education, I firstly want to take note of what is often viewed as a positive stereotype. And I specifically want to take note of this one because it's something that comes up in education quite frequently, and it's called the model minority myth. Now, not all stereotypes appear negative at the face value. And the model minority myth is a great example of this. It's actually a stereotypical belief that individuals from certain racial minorities or groups will outperform others, that their superior intelligence will outperform others, or maybe not even intelligence, just outperform in many different ways, but often related to intelligence. And typically this stereotype is applied to Southeast Asian communities. Now, you have to think about where terms come from when we're thinking about positive stereotypes. So important to do your research and understand. So the term model minority was actually originally coined in 1966 in America by a white journalist. And it was used to describe the so-called success stories. And so you can already see how this was created to be viewed as something positive right from the get-go. But anyway, they took these success stories of some of the Japanese American families who during World War II were forced into internment or pushed to enlist in the military as a means to prove their patriotism, and yet were able to rebuild and reintegrate into society after the war. So those success stories were coined as the model minority, right? So for some reason, this term, or not for some reason, they made it sound very positive. They made it seem positive with these success stories, right? But today it's understood that this term actually causes harm to Asian communities by ignoring the individual experiences of different Asian folks and pitting racial minorities against one another. The stereotype can also be very harmful to the Asian community in a number of ways. It sets higher expectations of Asian students, and educators may offer those students less guidance and support because of that positive stereotype. So perhaps because intelligence is seen as positive, as a positive thing, this is seen as a positive stereotype, and of course the way that it was originally written with success stories. But I personally don't feel that there are any positive stereotypes because I can't think of a stereotype that doesn't in some way cause harm to someone or to some group of people. So really question, and if there are positive stereotypes, I can't wait to take a look at the chat and really evaluate if there are some more positive stereotypes that genuinely don't harm and don't inflict that harm. So I'm excited to look at that, but something to consider when you're thinking of positive stereotypes, okay? Now, the last slide in this section here talks about combating those barriers to anti-oppressive education. Now, easier said than done. I'll be the first one to say that. And again, I am certainly not the end all be all for this. I am certainly not perfect with all of the things that I do here. I try my best to, practice what I preach and to make sure that I'm doing these things, but I'm also constantly learning, unlearning, and relearning. Definitely not the end all be all for this topic. And we know that we have some biases, right? So should we maybe just not discuss it and we'll just say what we think that everyone wants to hear about those topics, but then continue to have our own opinions and thoughts in our own time? Well, that actually may be the approach that some educators take because it feels safe to simply, regurgitate the information that you read in a textbook or in an old curriculum plan. It feels safe because it's not something new and you kind of don't have that accountability. And sometimes genuinely, there is great learning to be had in those old lesson plans, in those old textbooks. Sometimes there's wonderful learning to be had, definitely not discounting that. But sometimes that learning can be very harmful. So, for instance, you need to consider relearning about a tragic instance may be harmful. It may actually trigger people more so than it allows them to learn. So really consider what learning you're trying to get out of introducing a topic. And if it might do more harm than good, perhaps it should be left out of this time, right? So many educators encounter similar challenges or barriers when they consider anti-oppressive education. And sometimes those challenges are rooted in bias, as we just discussed, but there are other factors at play as well. So I've talked a little bit about Kevin Kumashiro, and he notes that one of the barriers to anti-oppressive education is the unconscious desire for the repetition of what one already knows and the psychic resistance to change. So there is fear in the unknown, and it's a natural response to resist change. Maddie talked about how we have the HiMama app, and when I was working in onboarding, facing those customers, training them on how to use the app, we often encountered educators who were experiencing resistance from their staff because they weren't prepared to change. In fact, there's a previous webinar on that resistance to change, and again, if you're interested in any of the previous webinars from the 2022 year, those are all included in HiMama Academy. So if you ever miss a webinar, don't worry. We definitely have access to those through HiMama Academy. So you can always reach out to a member of our team to talk about that, okay? So that change management is something we experience in many different parts of our life, whether it be implementing a new app or challenging ourselves to knowledge, right? It's natural to experience resistance to change. And it's no different when we're challenging ourselves to change what we know. Now, another barrier to anti-oppressive education might simply be the circumstances of your life compared to that of your students. Tara Goldstein, a professor at OISE, which is the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, she's quoted noting that it is important for teachers to recognize how their own personal responses to student circumstances may differ from their students. You can't expect someone to react the way that you would react, the same way that you can't assume that what will be harmful or helpful to a student based on your own ideas of what would be helpful or harmful for you. And the last barrier that I want to touch upon today is inexperience. Now, again, I draw upon the words of Tara Goldstein when she states that beginning teachers often enter the teaching space with negative, naive, and potentially harmful knowledge about students whose families are different from their own and whom they have little contact with. Which is why anti-oppressive education requires educating yourself about who your students are, asking questions, and always being open to challenging what you know. And in my opinion, most importantly, learning to know less and learn more, right? Now, when it comes to battling these barriers, Tara puts it in a very neat way. And she states that what educators need to do is to include other people's families in the curriculum in ways that challenge those stereotypes and myths. Okay, and I'll double down on that one. Include other people's families in the curriculum in ways that challenge stereotypes and myths. So it seems simple, very kind of blanket statement there, but so incredibly important that you're challenging stereotypes and myths through the way that you represent families, right? So understand stereotypes and myths. If you're thinking, I'm not sure what the common stereotypes are, look up common stereotypes. Ask people what common stereotypes may exist in your region or area, or even do some research on Google, and then challenge those stereotypes in your curriculum, in your materials, in your learning. Okay, so as we kind of jump into the last section here, we're going to look a little bit more at combating those anti-oppressive barriers through practice. What can we do in practice? So now that we have some good knowledge and understanding of what anti-oppressive education even means, let's look at how to implement inclusive discussions, create welcoming spaces, and include representative materials. So to combat those barriers that we discussed, we're going to need some tools in our tool belt, right? So let's jump first into a safe space. I'm sure this is a term that you've heard, and if you haven't heard it, I'm glad you're hearing it now because it's very important. So before we introduce discussions or topics, we need to make sure that the environment is a safe one. Because anytime you have an anti-oppressive kind of curriculum or topic, you have to be aware that there can be harm, right? So we have to be aware of that. If we're not introducing these topics in a safe space, the oppression, there can actually be harm done through the space as well, right? Not just the material. So how can we make that space welcoming and safe? Well, let's start with the physical environment and the materials that we have. First off, this space should be comfortable for everyone. Having mats, individual mats or cushions, or some sort of mark that allows students to feel that there's a space that's theirs, that they can claim that space and help them feel safe. And ideally, these individual spaces would be accessible to everyone equitably, right? And then these spaces should be able to be defined. The parameters of that space should be able to be defined by another individual visually. Someone should be able to look at that space and go, oh, that is Kayla's space right there. I can tell because I see, the mat that she's sitting on or whatever the case may be, so that people can really respect each other's space and feel that they can be comfortable and in their own space without other people intruding during any kind of vulnerable discussion. And we discussed how representative materials can help students feel safe and welcomed as well. So always keep that in mind in terms of the books that you have and like your craft supplies, making sure that those are representative. That helps in an environment to have people feeling safe and included and welcomed. Also consider materials that would be beneficial to help students with unique needs that they might have to have the most positive day possible. For instance, having headsets available, because you may have students with auditory sensitivities or that may just be able to focus better if they had access to headsets. Fidget spinners, fidget toys, having access to those things, especially during group times and stories, in times where you're expecting children to sit still or maybe do something that is very counterintuitive to their own personal needs and their own personal ways of existing, right? Have access to those different materials. Also, assist scissors. Maybe someone needs assist scissors. Have multiple pairs available, not just one pair for one child where it has their name on it and they feel, have multiple pairs available so that other children, maybe another child might benefit from that as well that you didn't consider would benefit from that, right? Always have all of those materials available to everyone. And of course, we can't have 30 of everything. I understand that we have budget restrictions, that we have different ways. Always do the best you can to look into community resources, outreach, volunteers, ask for help, right? Ask for help when you need it and do the best you can. I'm not asking anyone to go out of pocket here. I'm not asking anyone to do anything that they're not capable of. Just do the best you can here. These are definitely just possibilities and different ideas. Take what you can do and run with it, alter it. If you have other ideas or if there's any materials that have really helped out in your classroom, I definitely encourage you to pop those in the chat so that we can see what types of materials other people are using that help out in their families and in their centers and in their classrooms, okay? Visual charts, often we'll have visual charts on the wall to help students, especially at a young age, identify steps. And if we have extra visual charts for students with special needs, make sure you refer to those in front of the whole group, not just that one individual, saying to them individually, oh, take a look at your charts that you know what to do, refer to the whole group. Hey, everybody, when you're going to the bathroom, don't forget to look at the pictures, right? You need to pull up your pants and do whatever, and make sure you're referring to the visual chart to the whole group so that it's seen as something that everyone has access to, that it's normal for everyone to refer to that chart so that that student doesn't feel like they're abnormal or that they're being centered out when they need to refer to it. Okay, and accessible materials. Can everyone reach the art easel, right? Something that seems simple, but maybe isn't true. Do you need a stool for someone? Do you need to lower the easel? Do we need to move it to a space where a wheelchair could access it? What do we need to do there? And then it's so important to offer solo spaces. Group learning is incredible. Social development is important. 100%, we need lots of group activity, but we also need solo spaces. The same way that sometimes you need a moment away from your coworkers or your family or your friends, you need that moment, that solo space. So do children. They also need that time to reflect, to think, to just experience themselves, right? So make sure that there's spaces for one individual to spend time alone. Have more than one space like that if you can in the room, but at least one space where someone can go and let it be known that if someone's in that space, they won't be bothered, that that's a space where you get to go, where it's, there's an invisible door and no one gets to walk in there if the space is in use. One person only. And it should be a space that anyone could use if it's open, not just one designated child, but can be really, really helpful for those children who get that sensory overload and need that time to themselves, but feel that it's hard to get because maybe people are always, in their space or whatever the case may be. Design a space that way where someone can go and feel safe, feel like no one's going to pester them, no one's going to be in their space and give them anxiety or whatever they're experiencing because they have that unique individual space. Okay. You also want to make sure that you're, like we said, not centering the child out and designating one material for one child unless it's absolutely necessary for them in that moment in time. But we want to make sure that the child doesn't feel like they are not the norm and they're being accommodated, right? That's why it's so important to expect rather than accommodate. The next point here, classroom culture. So how can you create a culture of respect in your classroom to help ensure that the space remains safe at all times? Well, first things first, you. You need to model the behavior, and so do the other adults that are in your space. So volunteers, part-time workers, other teachers, custodians, anyone that enters that space, it's pretty insane to expect children to create a culture that's not modeled by the adults in the space. It's pretty outrageous to ever expect that of a child, that they create a culture that's not modeled in front of them, right? So it's so important. And of course, this can be a very difficult task because we're talking about adults who you have no control over, but you need to set expectations and verbally note when something could have been done differently. If another teacher walks into your classroom and goes, "Oh, wow, there's so many girl toys out today," verbally in front of the entire class, you can note, "Oh, we don't have girl toys and boy toys in here. We just have toys for everyone." Right? You can note that lightheartedly so that the children hear it. Definitely have a discussion with the other adult afterwards to help them understand why you said that. But it's important to say it in front of the children. If you only say it to the adult afterwards, well, the children heard that and they were like, "Oh, girl toys. Okay, well, maybe, okay, so that's a girl toy," and they've started now to think in those lines. You need to make sure that you verbally correct that, so that you verbally make sure that the student or that the children hear you standing up for that inclusivity and standing up for that notion that, toys are not gendered in this particular example. Now, psychological safety is also really important, not just physical safety. People need to feel psychologically safe if you want them to be acting in any type of vulnerable act, right? Anywhere they're revealing things about themselves or engaging in discussions about themselves that could be triggering or traumatic or any of those, you need to make sure that there's psychological safety. And what's the best way that we can do that as educators? Well, to be predictable. Be predictable to your children. They should be able to predict the way that you're going to react to something. If one day, you react with all the calmness in the world, and the next day you're acting like this to the same type of situation, a student might not feel safe discussing something with you because they don't know how to gauge how you'll react, and therefore they kind of shut down and don't have that safety of being psychologically safe in order to open up and feel vulnerable with you. Okay. And like I already noted, making sure we address concerns immediately, like with the educator in front of the students. Similarly, if there's a group of students engaging in something that you hear or see and you're like, "Oh, what's going on there?" Address it right away, right? Go up to that group. You don't need to single it out in front of the whole class, but go to that group where you heard or saw something taking place and kind of ask what's going on, right? Is everyone okay? Or what's going on over here? Are we discussing anything fun? What are we talking about, right? And kind of get to the bottom. And once the act that was kind of concerning or the wording that was concerning gets stated, you can ask how everyone feels about it. And, was it kind or could it have been hurtful? Is there another way to go about it? Lots of different kind of questions you can ask there. Real life example from one of my preschool classrooms. I had two children, let's call them Taylor and Julian for the purpose of today. So there were three students in the dramatic area. There were dresses and jewelry and vanities and props and all kinds of different costumes to dress up in, lots of different things available in the dramatic center that week for dress up fun. And Julian, little boy Julian, decides that he's going to wear a dress, and he puts this princess dress on with a necklace and he's twirling and he is just loving it. And Taylor runs up to me so concerned, "Miss Kayla, Miss Kayla, Miss Kayla." I said, "Yes, Taylor, Julian's wearing a dress." I said, "Okay." And she's like, "Well, he's wearing a dress. It's okay. And does it fit him?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, so then do you think he could wear it?" And she kind of thought for a minute. I was like, "Does he like it?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, if he likes it and it fits him, then is it okay if he wears it?" And she was like, "Yeah," I'm like, "Okay, I guess so." And she went right back to playing. And it's just so interesting how as adults, it takes us so much longer to be like, "What do you mean?" "Well, no, he's a boy. He can't have that," because we have these preconceived notions in our minds of what it means to be a boy or a girl and what we can and cannot wear. Whereas Taylor, this young, preschooler didn't have necessarily that mold 100% yet. It was starting to develop. That's why she questioned it. But when I questioned her back, she questioned herself. She questioned what she knew about whether or not a boy could wear a dress. And she said, you know what? I am now going to unlearn that boys can't wear dresses and relearn that anyone can wear whatever they feel comfortable in, right? So really great moment there. I absolutely enjoyed that moment. And her mom even came to talk to me about it the next day, about how she came home talking about how everyone's allowed to wear a dress. So I think that's wonderful. The last point on this slide here is inclusive language. So be intentional with your language, be mindful of what you're talking about. Like we just talked about, girl toys, boy toys, language like that, it actually just like it creates division, right? If you're a girl, line up here. If you're a boy, line up here. Well, why do we need to have the lines in that place? Could we not say if you have short hair, line up here, and long hair, line up here? If you have polka dots on your shirt, line up here, stripes, line up here. There are many different ways to call people to line up without forcing them to choose an identity, because maybe they're not 100% sure about their identity and you're creating a very stressful moment for them. Another one here is be very careful with nicknames. That's the last thing I'm going to say on this topic here, is that, we know that we're supposed to call children by their names. But as a preschool teacher myself, I know sometimes it's sweetheart, buddy, or whatever the case may be, but we have to be careful about the types of nicknames that we're using and the implications that they might have. I'll use another personal example here. Again, my son, an interracial child, and my mom is a white woman. And when he was born, he's very chunky, and my mom would call him Chunky Monkey. And my partner and I kind of said to her, the term monkey has a lot of really negative connotations for the Black community. And so we don't really want Tristan to have, his grandmother calling him monkey, even though you're saying it in an endearing and positive way. The term just, it doesn't sit well with us. And so, we kind of had that discussion with her. She was very understanding of it and was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And it's like, it's not about being sorry. It's about unlearning, actioning, and relearning, right? Everyone has these biases. Everyone has, you don't know everything. I hadn't necessarily thought of that before having a biracial child. That's not necessarily something I had considered either. So just being aware that, you can learn, unlearn in any moments at any age. But there are lots of different ways that we can get help doing that. And one of the best ways is through books. So we talked a little bit about a few books that you could use, and I'll just kind of quickly touch upon a few here. And books, I will say, are the perfect tool for opening discussions. Really great tool for getting that going with your children. Really, one of my favorite books ever is The Family Book. If you've never read it, I highly recommend it. By Todd Parr, The Family Book. They talk about how some families have two moms, some families have two dads, or one parent, or step families. Some families adopt children. Some families are the same color or different colors. Some, and then you can go ahead and ask students if they want to say who's in their family. Does anyone want to draw a portrait of your family or bring in photos of your families? We could create a class album of our families. It also goes into the similarities, right? It says that all people like to hug each other and celebrate special days, that all families are sad when they lose someone they love, and that all families can help each other be strong. It is so important to highlight the ways in which we're all similar, the ways in which we're all human. After all, we're not defined by the boxes that we check. So there are some fun differences in the families highlighted, and that can lead to those great group questions near the end of the book, right? He goes and he's like, some like to be clean and some like to be messy. Some families like to be loud, some like to be quiet. So I would always ask my students, does your family like to be loud or quiet? And they love engaging with the material that way and seeing who, the similarities and differences between them and their peers. And Todd Parr ends the book by saying, and I'll quote him here, "There are lots of different ways to be a family. Yours is special, no matter what kind it is." And such a great discussion and opening point for those discussions. And then really quickly here, one more book that I kind of want to touch upon is What If the Zebra Lost Their Stripes? This is one of my favorite books of all time. I cry every time I read it because it's just so beautiful. But it talks about, if half of the zebras lost their black stripes and half of the zebras lost their white stripes, would they still be friends now that they look differently, now that half of them are black and half of them are white? And it's the perfect introduction to the topic of race discussions. And one of the experiments that I like to do alongside this one is an egg cracking experiment. If you haven't tried this one, great way to understand that we're all human at our core is I'd take a brown egg and a white egg, crack them both, and then look at the yolks and understand that, oh, hey, regardless of the skin of this egg, the color on the outside of this egg, they're eggs on the inside. Similarly, regardless of the identity markers that we use to define ourselves, we're all human and we're all right. And seeing that connection between us all is so important to start from a young age, because that's going to be the number one way that they combat oppression in their lives, is by seeing the humanity in everybody. And then again, representation. So not only representation in books, but representation of the people in your classroom, and making sure that your readings are extremely meaningful through that representation, okay? So really quickly, I'm about to hand it over to Maddie here. The last slide just talks about hidden curriculum and understanding that not only what you're saying is being taught, but also the children are learning in moral ways, in different ways that they're developing through their emotions. So be cognizant of that as well, and ways that you can impact the curriculum through what you're not teaching, okay? So thank you guys so much. And Maddie, back at you there.
Kayla, thank you so much. That was such an engaging and well-spoken webinar. Thank you so much for sharing so many personal examples. I don't know about anyone else on here, but that is absolutely the best way I learned to connect and put myself into those shoes and go back into the classroom and kind of see how it's all happening. So thank you so much for sharing through that lens. It is so appreciated. And you're just so connected and so passionate about the topic at hand. It was just a beautiful presentation to watch and be a part of. So Kayla, thank you so much. I am going to go ahead and really quickly share my screen. Okay, what we're going to do really quickly before we let you all get back on with your days and your long weekend ahead is we have a very quick poll for everyone on here today. As always, we want to know, do you currently make time in your center to make your center more inclusive and welcoming for all children, for all families? How do you do that? We also want to know if you're interested in learning about how the HiMama app can save you up to 3 hours a day on a lot of that documentation, printing, cutting, all that stuff that takes quite a lot of time. Do you want that time back so you can really focus on meaningful connections with your families, with children, and being present in the classroom? HiMama can help you do that. So Lena will post a link in the chat so you can learn more about HiMama and see how HiMama can save you all of that time so you can really focus on what matters most, which is making your classroom a safe and welcoming environment for all children, like Kayla spoke to us about today. And that is our webinar for today. Before we wrap up, I just want to say another big thank you to Kayla for being here with us today, sharing her time and her knowledge with us on this Thursday afternoon before the long weekend. Before we wrap up, it is 3 o'clock on the dot, but just a quick reminder to everyone on here about our giveaway. Keep an eye out for that show notes email next week, early next week. We will be sending you the recording. We will be sending you the slides. We'll also be sending you your certificate and announcing the winner of our $50 gift card giveaway. So keep an eye out for that early next week. And what's next? We are bringing back the one and only Ron Schwally to talk about connecting with your inner child to support children's development. If you have never been to one of Ron's webinars, it is a must attend. They're so fun. You will laugh, you will move. It is always a great time. So please do sign up, and I hope we will see you all here. Same time, same place next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern time, so we can get into connecting with your inner child with Ron Schwally. It's going to be amazing. And lastly, if you're not connected with us yet on any of our social media accounts, follow us on Instagram. You can see what's upcoming with our webinars a full month ahead, and also join our Facebook Circle Time group if you haven't yet. There are so many great ideas being shared in there, what you're doing this summer with children, what you do to make your classroom inclusive. It's a great community of educators sharing our ideas. So please do pop in there. And otherwise, thank you so much to everybody for being here with us today to take time to learn about creating an inclusive classroom at your center. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and your long weekend ahead if you do have one. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Take care.